Eleanor Whitaker slammed the serving spoon onto the table so hard the gravy sloshed over the rim. "Get out!" The man at the end of the table didn't flinch, didn't blink, just sat there in his trail dust and his silence like he had every right in the world to be in her home. "Nell," her father started. "I said get out." Then her father spoke the 4 words that stopped her cold. "He came to marry you." If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The supper had been Eleanor Whitaker's idea, not the guest, not the arrangement, not the quiet conspiracy her father had been building for weeks behind her back while she hauled water and kept the ledgers and pretended she didn't notice how his hands shook when he thought she wasn't watching. The supper had been her idea because Amos Whitaker hadn't eaten a proper meal in 4 days, and Nell had told herself that if she set a real table with the good lamp burning and her mother's white dishes, he might actually sit down long enough to finish a plate. She hadn't counted on company. She heard the horse first. One horse moving slow and deliberate up the yard, the kind of pace that belonged to a man who wasn't in a hurry because he'd already decided how the evening was going to go. She pushed back the curtain with 2 fingers and looked out into the fading summer light. How was tall? That was the first thing she noticed. Tall and broad through the shoulders, with a dark leather vest, worn soft with use, and trail dust settled into every crease of him like he'd been riding since before she woke up that morning. He swung down from the saddle without any of the stiffness she saw in most men past 35, which told her his joints still obeyed him, even if his manners apparently didn't, because he tied his horse at her fence post without asking and walked straight toward her front door like he owned the porch. She let the curtain fall. "Papa." She came into the main room and found Amos already on his feet moving toward the door with more speed than she'd seen from him in weeks. "Papa, who is that company?" Amos didn't look at her. "Set another plate, Nell." "I haven't agreed to set another plate." "Set it anyway." She said it. She told herself she said it because she was tired, and it wasn't worth the argument, and she told herself that all the way to the cupboard and all the way back, and she almost believed it by the time the knock came at the door. Her father opened it himself. The man filled the doorframe. Not in an aggressive way, not in the way of men who wanted you to feel small, just in the plain physical fact of him, the way a mountain fills a horizon. He stepped inside and took his hat off, which was at least something, and he looked first at Amos and then briefly at Nell. His eyes were gray. Not the washed-out gray of winter sky, but darker, more considered the color of ridge rock just before a storm decides whether it's coming or not. "Whitaker," he said. "Rourke." Her father gripped his hand. "Good of you to come down. Wasn't easy to pull away. Lost another section of flume 2 nights ago. Come in and sit down. Nell's made a fine supper." She hadn't made it for him. But she brought it out anyway, because there was nothing else to do, and she set the bread and the beans and the roasted beef and the corn that had somehow survived what the dry summer was doing to everything else in the valley. And she poured the coffee, and she stood at the end of the table and watched Caleb Rourke settle into her father's second-best chair like he had been expected. He hadn't said a word to her. Not a greeting, not a thank you for the extra plate. He picked up his coffee cup and spoke directly to her father about flume damage and water pressure and the upstream survey stakes, and Amos leaned forward and answered him like a man who had been waiting all week for this exact conversation, and Nell stood there holding the empty coffee pot and understood with a slow-building certainty that she had been deliberately excluded from whatever this was. She sat down. She served herself. She ate in silence for 4 minutes, which was about as long as her patience had ever lasted in her entire 28 years on this earth. Then Caleb Rourke set down his coffee cup, glanced at the window like he was calculating the light, and said to her father, "The South Spring has to be open to high raven cattle by sunrise." Nell set down her fork. "That spring," he continued, "is the last reliable water between the valley floor and the upper ridge. Your daughter cannot manage that volume alone through a dry season." The word alone landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She felt it ripple. She felt it reach all the way to the edge of something she had been holding carefully in check since the moment he walked through her door without acknowledging she existed. Mr. Rourke. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He looked at her, like he was noticing her for the first time, or like he'd noticed her all along and had simply decided the conversation didn't require her yet. The South Spring, she said, is on Whitaker land. It has been on Whitaker land since my grandfather drove the first stake. And the question of who manages what on Whitaker land is not a question that gets settled over my supper table without my input. I'm not here to argue property lines. Then what are you here for? He picked up his coffee cup again. To make an arrangement that benefits both ranches before neither of us has any cattle left to argue over. You could have sent a letter. Letters don't fix flumes. You're not fixing my flumes. You're sitting in my kitchen telling my father that I can't manage my own water. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't apology. It wasn't exactly impatience either. It was something more complicated than both, like a man who had said a thing that came out wrong and knew it and was calculating whether to correct it or press on. He pressed on. I'm saying the situation is larger than one spread. The creek below the ridge is running at less than half its normal summer flow. What's left is the spring, and the spring serves both our herds. We need a formal arrangement before the water runs short enough to cause real trouble. I agree with that, Nell said. I've agreed with that since April. I sent your foreman a written proposal in May. He returned it unsigned. Caleb set the cup down again. She continued. I proposed shared access hours, rotational use, a joint repair schedule for the channel. Your foreman wrote back 2 words. Do you know what they were? Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. He wrote, not interested. Nell folded her hands on the table. So you'll understand why I find it a little difficult to sit here and be told that I cannot manage the water situation when I was the one who tried to manage it 3 months ago, and your ranch refused. The silence that followed was long enough to hear the lamp flicker. Amos cleared his throat. Nell reached across the table and picked up the serving spoon. She held it in her hand, not threatening, just held it, the way a person holds something familiar when they need a moment to think. Then Caleb Rourke looked at her and said in a tone she could not quite read, that proposal should have been accepted. It was not a full apology. It was not even close to one. But it was something she hadn't expected, and it loosened something tight in her chest, just enough to make her dangerous. Then accept it now, she said. It's not that simple anymore. The survey stakes have been moved. Moved how? Someone's been at the upper markers. The original boundary posts for the spring access corridor are gone. Without them, neither ranch has a documented claim that holds in a county court. Nell felt the cold of that settle over her. She knew what it meant. Without the markers, Whitaker Crossing had no legal ground to refuse anyone access to the spring, and no legal ground to protect it either. When did you find this? She asked. 3 days ago. And you're telling me now, over supper? I'm telling you now because I needed to speak with your father first. That stopped her. She looked at Amos. Her father wasn't looking at his plate. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since the night her mother died. That particular combination of sorrow and stubbornness that meant he had already done something he knew she wasn't going to forgive easily. Papa, she said quietly. What did you need to speak with him about? Amos set down his fork. He straightened in his chair the way he used to do when she was small and he was about to explain something he believed she needed to hear whether she wanted to or not. Nell, he said. Caleb Rourke came down from the mountain because I wrote to him. I wrote to him 6 weeks ago. About the spring. About the spring. And about you. The serving spoon was still in her hand. There is a way, Amos said carefully, to protect the Whitaker water rights, settle the access question, and make sure this ranch survives past this summer. A way that doesn't require a lawyer or a county judge or a fight none of us can afford. Say it plainly, Papa. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, a marriage between Whitaker Crossing and High Raven would give both ranches standing as a single legal entity. The spring falls within the combined property. No outside claim can touch it. The lamp on the table burned very still. Nell heard her own heartbeat. She turned to look at Caleb Rourke. How was watching her? Not with satisfaction, not with the particular smug expression of a man who thought this had already been decided. He was watching her the way she imagined a man watches a cliff edge when he's not entirely sure of the ground beneath him, careful, attentive, and not entirely comfortable. "You agreed to this," she said to him. He held her gaze. "I agreed to consider it." Those 4 words. She turned them over in her mind and found that consider was somehow worse than agreed, because agree would have meant arrogance and consider meant he had weighed her, weighed the arrangement, weighed the value of it, weighed whether she was worth the trouble of riding down a mountain, and reached a verdict he hadn't yet shared. She stood up from the table. The chair scraped back. Caleb Rourke didn't move. Nell walked around the end of the table, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the empty chair beside him, walked to the front door, and threw it out into the yard. "Follow it," she said. Nell Amos was on his feet. "This man rode down here because you wrote him a letter about my future without asking me a single word about it. And he sat at my table eating my supper and telling me I can't manage my own water. And now I find out the whole purpose of the evening was to hand me over like a fence line adjustment." She turned back to Caleb. "Did my father tell you what I'm like? Did he tell you I'd be agreeable? Did he tell you I'd be grateful?" Caleb said nothing. "I am not water rights with a wedding ring, Mr. Rourke." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that too. "And I am not a solution to a property problem. And I am not going to stand in this room and pretend that either of you has done anything tonight except treat my life like a ledger entry." Caleb stood up from the table then. He did it slowly, unhurried the way he did everything, and he stood at his full height and looked at her across the width of the room and said, "You're right." She hadn't expected that. "You're right that I sat down at your table without thanking you for the meal. You're right that I said something careless about the water. And you're right that I should have written to you directly when I received your proposal in May." He paused. "I didn't. That was a failure of judgment." "It was," she agreed. "But the survey stakes are still gone," he said. "And Silas Creed was at the county land office 2 days ago. I don't know what he filed. I know he's been buying up drought debt in the valley for 3 months, and I know he's had his eyes on the spring since last spring when the creek started dropping." The name Silas Creed did something unpleasant to the temperature of the room. Nell had heard the name. Everyone in the valley had heard it. The polished representative of the Western Meridian Silver Company, who smiled at every rancher he met and made very reasonable-sounding offers for things that weren't quite for sale yet. "What did he file?" she asked. "I don't know. That's why I rode down tonight." "Not for the marriage. The marriage was your father's suggestion. I came because I needed to know what Whitaker Crossing is willing to do before Creed does something neither of us can undo." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Amos, who was standing by his chair with one hand on the table and the particular gray color to his face that she had learned meant his heart was working harder than it should. She made herself breathe. "Sit down, Papa," she said quietly. Amos sat. She stayed standing. "Mr. Rourke, I will not discuss marriage with you tonight or any other night until I understand exactly what legal situation we are in. Is that clear?" "Clear," he said. "But I am willing to hear what you know about Creed and the land office, for the sake of the ranch." She met his gray eyes and held them. "Not for any other reason." "Understood," he said. He sat back down. She didn't sit. She stood at the end of the table with her arms crossed and her mother's white dishes around her, and the lamp burning low, and she listened to Caleb Rourke lay out what he knew. The missing survey stakes, the dried creek, the debt purchases, the quiet inquiries Creed had been making about water rights in 3 counties, and she kept her face still and her mind sharp, and she asked questions that made him pause twice, which told her something about him she hadn't expected to find. I wasn't dismissive of her questions. He answered them. After an hour, Amos fell asleep in his chair, which happened sometimes now, sudden and complete, his body making decisions. His stubbornness wouldn't allow when he was awake. Nell pulled the blanket from the arm of the sofa and laid it over his shoulders without waking him. When she turned around, Caleb was standing by the door. "I'll ride out," he said. "Wait." He stopped. She picked up the lamp from the table and stood there holding it. Not entirely sure why she'd said it, except that there was something left she needed to say, and she needed to say it while her father was asleep and couldn't interrupt with his worry. "My father is sick," she said. "Not in a way anyone's going to fix. His heart is it's been failing since last winter. He thinks I don't know how bad it is. I know." Caleb was quiet. "He wrote you that letter because he's frightened about what happens to this ranch when he's gone. He's not trying to control me. He genuinely believes this arrangement would protect me." She looked down at the lamp flame. "That doesn't make it right. But I want you to understand that he's a good man, who is scared, not a man trying to sell his daughter." "I know," Caleb said. "He told me in the letter." She looked up. "He told me he was ill. He told me he was trying to secure your future before he ran out of time to do it. He also told me—" Caleb stopped for a moment. "He told me you were the best ranch manager in the valley, and that any man who didn't recognize that wasn't worth your time." She didn't know what to do with that. "He may be right," Caleb added with the first thing that wasn't quite a smile, but might become one under different circumstances. "About both parts." She walked to the door and opened it for him. He took his hat from where she'd thrown it. She'd noticed he'd stepped out and retrieved it during the conversation without making a point of it, and he stepped out into the night air, and then he turned back once. "The spring gate on your north channel," he said. "The pressure fitting on the east arm. It needs replacing before the summer peak flow. If it blows, you'll lose the south pasture access." She stared at him. "I noticed when I rode in," he said simply. "Thought you should know." Then he walked to his and swung up and rode out of the yard without looking back. And Nell stood in the doorway with the lamp in her hand and watched him go, and told herself firmly, and with considerable conviction, that she felt nothing except the reasonable professional respect of a rancher who had just received useful information about her water infrastructure. She almost believed it. She went back inside and sat down at the table and opened the ledger she kept in the top drawer, the one with the irrigation calculations she'd been working on since May, and she found the column she'd labeled Spring Access Disputed, and she sat there for a while looking at the numbers. Then she wrote in the margin in her small, precise hand, "Survey stakes gone. Creed filing something. Flume damage high Raven. Not coincidental." She stared at those words for a long time. Outside, the summer darkness settled over a valley that was quietly running out of water, and somewhere above the ridge, the mountain spring that both ranches needed to survive kept running steadily downhill toward a channel that someone had been quietly dismantling. And Nell Whitaker, who had kept this ranch alive through 2 failed summers, and her father's failing heart, closed the ledger and went to check the south gate fitting herself before she went to bed. She found it exactly as he had described, cracked through the collar, one good surge of pressure away from failing completely. She fixed it in the dark with her bare hands and a wrench, and the particular focused fury of a woman who is very tired of being right about things that shouldn't require her to be. Then she stood there in the warm night with grease on her fingers and looked up at the ridge where High Raven Ranch sat somewhere above the tree line, invisible in the dark. "Not water rights with a wedding ring," she said again quietly to nobody. But she stayed there a moment longer than she needed to, looking up. Then she went inside and locked the door and didn't think about gray eyes or the way a man's voice sounds when he admits without any drama that he was wrong. She didn't think about it at all. By morning, the south pasture was still standing. By morning, a rider from the county land office had left a notice folded under a rock at Whitaker Crossing's gate. Nell found it when she went out to feed at first light. She unfolded it with fingers that were still a little stiff from the night's repair work, and she read it twice in the early gray light before she understood what it said. Silas Creed had filed a claim. Not on the spring access corridor. Not on disputed boundary land. On the spring itself. She stood there in the growing light with the paper in her hand, and the valley spread out below her dry and golden and terrifyingly still. She went back inside. She took the ledger from the drawer. She found the column labeled Spring Access Disputed, and she drew a single line through it. Then below it she wrote, "This is war." She was still sitting there, still and deliberate, when hoofbeats came up the yard again, at a pace that wasn't patient or careful or unhurried. She recognized the horse before she reached the window. Caleb Rourke swung down from the saddle and crossed her yard in 4 strides and knocked twice hard. She opened the door. He was holding an identical notice. His jaw was set. His eyes had the quality of a man who had ridden hard and was working to keep his anger in a manageable place. "You got one too," she said. "I got one too." She looked at the paper in his hand, and then at the paper in her own hand. "He filed on both sides," she said. "He filed on both at once." "Yes. He's been planning this since before the creek started dropping. Probably since before last summer." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mr. Rourke," she said. "We have work to do." He came in. He took his hat off without being reminded. And this time, nobody threw anything. The notice from the county land office sat on the table between them like a third person in the room. Caleb pulled out the chair across from Nell and sat down without asking. She noticed that. Not the presumption of it. She'd stopped caring about the presumption of it somewhere between his first visit and his second, but the change in it. The night before, he had sat at the end of the table like a man attending a meeting. Now he sat across from her like a man who intended to have a real conversation. Amos was still asleep in the back room. Nell had checked on him before she opened the door. His breathing was even his color better than it had been in days. She'd let him sleep. Creed filed on both parcels simultaneously, Caleb said, which means he had the paperwork prepared in advance. He wasn't waiting to see how negotiations went. He was waiting for the right moment to file what was already written. "He's been waiting since before the creek started dropping," Nell said. "He knew about the drought before we did, or he caused some of it." Caleb looked at her. "You think the water loss is deliberate?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the survey stakes didn't walk away by themselves. And I think your flume didn't break in the same week Creed visits the land office by coincidence." She turned the county notice over and tapped the back of it. "Who else knew the stakes were gone before last night?" "My foreman, 2 of my riders, the county surveyor's office if Creed had a man in there." "Did you report the missing stakes to the county?" His jaw tightened. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because I wanted to find them first. If I report missing boundary markers without being able to say where they went, the county starts an inquiry that Creed can use to extend the dispute timeline. Longer inquiry means more time for him to consolidate the claim." Nell stared at him. "You understand property law." "My father paid for a lawyer twice in my life. Expensive education." He leaned forward. "What do you know about the original land grant for the spring?" "My grandfather's papers say the spring was designated as shared water for the Lower Valley homesteads when the territory surveyed the land in 1861. But the original survey map," she stopped, "is gone," he finished. "Has been gone since the records office fire in 73. She got up and went to the cabinet against the wall and opened the bottom drawer. She pulled out a tin box, the kind people kept important papers, in the kind that had survived because someone had thought to take it out of a building before it burned. "But my grandfather kept copies of everything. He didn't trust public offices." She set the tin on the table and opened it. Inside were folded papers, some of them brittle and yellowed at the edges, tied in small bundles with cotton cord. Nell untied the first bundle and spread the papers out carefully. Caleb leaned in. She watched his eyes move across the old handwriting. He read quickly, which surprised her. Not because she thought he was stupid, but because she had categorized him, she realized, as a man of physical competence rather than intellectual one, and the categorization was already proving wrong. "This is a freight receipt," he said, setting one paper aside. "This is a boundary description for the East Ridge. This." He picked up a folded paper and opened it slowly. "This is an affidavit from the original surveyor." Nell looked. "Thomas Carver. He was the territorial surveyor in 61. He states here that the spring headwaters and a 50-foot corridor in every direction were designated common water under Section 4 of the Homestead Act." Caleb read the relevant line aloud. "Meaning no private party may claim exclusive ownership." If that holds, Creed's filing is invalid. If that holds. Caleb set the paper down. "This is an affidavit, not the map. The map would show the exact coordinates. Creed's lawyer will argue that without the original survey map, the affidavit is an old man's opinion. Then we need the map. The map burned in 73. "My grandfather believed in copies," Nell said. She was already looking at the other bundles. Caleb helped her without being asked. He handled the old papers with a care that she noticed and filed away, because a man who had come purely for property gain would have flipped through them fast and impatient. He went through them methodically, reading each one, setting aside what was irrelevant, stacking what might matter. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then Caleb held up a paper and said quietly, "Nell." She looked up. "Your grandfather wrote a letter to the county recorder in 1869. He mentions having the original survey duplicated by a second surveyor and sending the copy to the territorial commissioner's office in Denver." She crossed the room in 3 steps and took the letter from his hand and read it herself. The handwriting was her grandfather's. The date was August 1869. The language was plain and direct, the way her grandfather had always written, the way he had always spoken, no decoration, no ceremony, just the precise statement of fact. "I have caused a true copy of the spring survey of 1861 to be made by Mr. Elias Webb, licensed surveyor, and have forwarded same to the office of the territorial commissioner, under cover of separate letter, for purposes of preservation and public record." Nell read it twice. Then she said, "Denver." If the territorial commissioner's office kept their records. "They built a fireproof vault in 71. I read about it in the Tribune." She looked at him. "The copy might still be there." "It might. We need to get to Denver before Creed's lawyer does. We need to do several things before Denver." Caleb took the letter back and folded it with the same care he'd used handling everything else. "We need to find out who moved the stakes and whether Creed has anyone in our crews feeding him information. And we need to figure out why your water channel showed deliberate diversion signs 2 weeks ago." Nell went still. "What diversion signs?" He looked at her steadily. "My South Rider found a section of the upper mountain channel that had been rerouted. Not collapsed, rerouted. Someone had rebuilt a short run of it to carry water toward the ridge trail. It rained the next day and washed most of it out. I thought it was a drifter tapping water illegally. Now I'm not sure." "Why didn't you mention this last night?" "Last night I came to discuss a marriage arrangement I'd been asked to consider. I didn't expect to walk into a property ambush." He paused. "I should have mentioned it regardless. That's on me." She appreciated that he didn't dress the admission up. He said it plain and left it there. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the diversion," he told her. The precise location, the construction details, the direction the rerouted channel was running. Nell listened without interrupting, and while she listened, she was building a picture in her mind, the kind of picture she built from irrigation calculations and survey data. The kind of picture that showed her where water came from and where it went and what happened to the land in between when someone interfered with the natural pattern. When he finished, she said, "That direction leads toward the Meridian Company's exploratory camp." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "Show me." She got the map she kept pinned to the wall of her office, not an official survey, but a working map. She'd drawn herself over years, adding measurements and notes and landmarks as she learned the land. She spread it on the table. He leaned over it beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid presence of a man who spent his days outdoors and carried the physicality of that work in every movement. She focused on the map. She traced the water channel with her finger. The spring source. The main run. The split where the east arm branched toward High Raven's upper grazing. The south run toward Whitaker Crossing. And then partway up the mountain channel, the point where Caleb's rider had found the rerouted section. She drew her finger from that point in a straight line toward the ridge. It aimed directly at a cluster of symbols she'd marked 6 months ago when the Meridian Company first set up camp. "There," she said. Caleb looked at the map for a long time. "That camp needs water," he said. "Mining operations need significant water. If Creed can control the spring, he doesn't just have power over the ranches, he has a private water supply for the mine. And he can charge the ranches for access and use the revenue to fund the mining operation." Nell straightened up. "He's not just speculating on land. He's building an infrastructure play. The spring is the centerpiece, which is why the claim filed on both parcels at once. He needs both to establish total control of the water corridor." They looked at each other across the map. Something changed in that moment. Not dramatically, not with any softness or ceremony. It was simply the moment when two people who have been circling a problem from opposite sides of a fence realize they are looking at the same problem from the same direction, and the fence is no longer the relevant fact. "I need to ride the upper channel today," Nell said. "I need to see the diversion site myself." "It's a hard ride in the summer heat." She looked at him with an expression that required no words. He amended immediately. "I'll have my man meet us at the Ridge Trail junction." She corrected him without raising her voice. "I'll ride with you. Your man can meet us at the diversion point." He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he said, "Fair enough." She went to get her boots. The ride up the mountain trail took the better part of the morning, and it was not a comfortable ride. The summer heat was the kind that pressed down from above and radiated up from the dry earth and met in the middle at approximately the height of a person's face. The trail was steep in sections and rocky in others, and the brush on either side was dry enough to crackle when the wind moved through it, which it barely did. Caleb rode ahead on the steeper sections because he knew the trail and she didn't, and she let him because she was practical about things like that. On the flatter stretches they rode side by side. They didn't talk much. The terrain required attention, and both of them were the kind of people who gave attention where attention was required. But she noticed things. She noticed that when her horse balked at a section of loose shale, Caleb waited without comment. Comment didn't offer to take the reins, didn't suggest a different line, just held his own horse still and gave her space to handle it. She handled it. He moved on. She noticed that he rode without the small performances she'd seen in other men who wanted to appear capable. No unnecessary speed, no dramatic maneuvering, just efficient movement through difficult terrain in a way that conserved the horse's strength for the return trip. She noticed that when they stopped at mid-morning to water the horses at a small trickle that was all that remained of a stream that should have been running knee-deep at this time of year, he filled his hat for his horse before he drank himself. She noticed these things and kept them to herself. They reached the diversion point at mid-morning. Caleb's rider, a quiet young man named Cord, who clearly had instructions to say very little, was already there with a second horse. He nodded at Nell without surprise, which told her Caleb had described the situation without any particular editorial about a woman coming along. She dismounted and went to look. The rerouted channel had been mostly washed back by the rain, Caleb had mentioned, but not entirely. There were still signs of deliberate work-cut wood-fitted stones, the kind of careful construction that took hours and knowledge. This wasn't a drifter tapping water out of thirst. This was someone who understood water management and had the tools and time to execute a rerouting. "How long would this have taken?" Caleb asked. Nell crouched and ran her hand along the fitted stones. "A full day. Probably 2." She stood and looked at the angle of the work. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They used the natural gradient to make the diversion look almost passive. If your rider hadn't noticed the slope direction was wrong, this could have gone undetected for weeks. "Long enough for Creed to establish use," Caleb said. "If his camp can prove sustained water access, he can argue prescriptive rights in addition to the filed claim." She looked at him. "He's building layers. If the filed claim fails, the prescriptive use argument is ready. If that fails, the missing survey stakes create enough uncertainty to delay the whole thing indefinitely while he keeps operating." Cord spoke up for the first time. "Ma'am, there's something else." They both turned. He pointed to a section of ground 20 feet from the channel work partially hidden by a boulder. Nell and Caleb walked over together. In the soft earth near the boulder was a set of boot prints, large, distinctive, with a heel that had a triangular cut in it, the kind of damage that left a memorable mark in soft ground. Beside the boot prints was a small piece of canvas, the kind used to wrap tools. And on the canvas, barely visible, was a stain. Nell crouched and looked at it closely. The stain was the particular reddish-brown of iron-based marking fluid, the kind used for one specific purpose in cattle country. Caleb crouched beside her. "That's branding fluid," he said. "Someone who works with brands was out here doing channel work," Nell said. She looked at the boot print. "Cord, do you recognize this heel mark?" The young rider looked uncomfortable. He looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Tell her what you know." Cord said, "That cut pattern. I've seen it. It belongs to a man named Jonah Pike. He's been riding for High Raven about 4 months. The name landed in the space between the three of them and sat there. Nell did not look at Caleb. She kept her eyes on the canvas and the boot print and the dried stain of branding fluid. "Where is Jonah Pike now?" she asked. "He rode out 2 days ago," Cord said. "Said he needed supplies. He hasn't come back." Nell stood up. She turned to Caleb then, and she made herself look at him directly, because she believed in looking at a situation directly, regardless of how uncomfortable the view was. His face was doing something controlled and careful. Not guilty, she was experienced enough with people to know the difference between a man hiding his own guilt and a man confronting someone else's. This was the second thing. She could see the anger building in him, the cold, specific anger of a man who has been used. "You didn't know," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," he said. His voice was flat and hard. "I didn't know." She believed him. She wasn't sure that was wise, but she believed him. "Then someone placed a man in your crew specifically to run this operation," she said. "Jonah Pike has been working for High Raven for 4 months. Creed filed his claim this week. The timing is not accidental." "No," Caleb said again. "It's not." He looked at Cord. "Ride back. I want a full accounting of every job Pike was assigned to since he hired on. Every area of the ranch he had access to. Every conversation any of our men remember having with him." Cord left immediately. Nell and Caleb stood by the damaged channel in the summer heat. "He's been inside your operation," she said, "which means he knows your survey records, your water schedules, your boundary markers." "He knows where everything is," Caleb said quietly. Or was. The weight of that settled over both of them. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his name. She noticed it. He noticed it too. She saw the slight change in his attention, the way a man registers something unexpected without making a point of it. If Pike was placed in your crew to feed Creed information, then Creed has known about the spring survey situation for months. He's known about the affidavit, possibly about the copy in Denver, possibly about your boundary markers. Then we need to get to Denver before he suppresses that record. We need to do more than that. She looked at the boot print one more time, then back at him. We need to set something up. Something that draws Pike back into the open before he can finish whatever Creed sent him to do. Caleb looked at her with a new kind of attention. The kind a man gives when he realizes the person he is talking to has moved 3 steps ahead of where he thought the conversation was going. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. She had a great deal in mind, but she wasn't ready to share it yet because a plan built on incomplete information was worse than no plan, and there were things she still needed to know. She needed to know more about Jonah Pike. She needed to know who in Creed's organization had access to the county land office. She needed to know whether the diversion pipe was still in place somewhere they hadn't found yet. "Not yet," she said. "But we need to talk to Martha Bell." He looked uncertain. "The storekeeper. Martha Bell knows everything that moves through this valley. She's been here longer than almost anyone. And she was a trail nurse before she opened the store, which means she knows how to keep a confidence, and she knows how to read people." Nell picked up the canvas scrap carefully and folded it. "If Jonah Pike has been in this valley for 4 months, Martha will have noticed him." They rode back down the mountain together. The descent was easier, but not fast, and the afternoon heat had reached its full intensity by the time they cleared the tree line. Nell could feel the dryness of the air in the back of her throat, the particular mineral taste of a summer that had taken more than it was supposed to give. Halfway down the trail, Caleb said without preamble, "My brother died on a pass like this one." She didn't respond immediately. She let the words sit. "Not this trail," he said. "The North Crossing. We were moving the herd too late in the season. I made the call. He argued against it. I outranked him at the ranch, so I decided." He was looking forward at the trail, not at her. The shale gave way on the third animal. The herd spooked. He went over the edge trying to turn them. "How long ago?" she asked. 4 years. "And you've been running High Raven alone since then?" Yes. She thought about that. About what 4 years of solitary responsibility in a dangerous place did to a person. about how it could make a man quiet in the particular way that wasn't coldness, but was something more like a wall built to hold something in. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. They rode the rest of the way in silence that was different from the silence on the way up. Less guarded, less careful. The kind of silence that's possible only between two people who have just exchanged something true. Martha Bell's store was at the south end of the main street, and it was, as always, the center of more information than its modest size suggested. Martha herself was a broad-shouldered woman with iron gray hair pinned up with a practicality that had clearly never concerned itself with fashion and eyes that recorded everything they saw without appearing to. She looked at Nell and Caleb coming through the door together and made no expression at all, which from Martha was its own kind of statement. "Nell Whitaker," she said, "and Caleb Rourke, together, on a Wednesday." "Martha," Nell said, "I need to ask you about a man named Jonah Pike." Martha's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. "Come in the back," she said. In the back room, surrounded by supply crates and the smell of dried goods, Martha told them what she knew. Jonah Pike had arrived in the valley in March, which was 2 weeks before Caleb's foreman hired him on. He had come from the east, he said, though he had a western way of moving that didn't match an eastern background. He had asked questions. Not obviously not in the way of a man running a survey, but in the way of a man collecting small pieces of information from many different sources, the kind of casual questions that blended into normal conversation, unless you were the kind of person who tracked what people asked. Martha was that kind of person. He asked about the spring 3 times, she said. Once in March, once in April, once in June. Different questions each time. March was about water rights in general, just curious talk. April was more specific, who owned what, where the boundary was. June. She stopped. June, Nell said. June, he asked whether I knew of any old survey documents that had survived the records fire. Martha looked at Nell directly. I told him I didn't know of any, because it wasn't his business. Did he ask about the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver? Martha paused. Not directly, but he asked whether the territory kept duplicate records of old land grants. Said he was curious about some property his family used to own. She shook her head. No family. That man was working. Caleb asked. Do you know where he's gone? I know where he was headed, Martha said. I saw him ride out 2 days ago. He was heading north. The only thing north on that road past the valley boundary is the Meridian Company camp, Nell said. Martha nodded. Nell and Caleb looked at each other. He's reporting to Creed, Caleb said, in person, and he's probably carrying the account of everything he found in your ranch records, Nell said, including what he may know about your grandfather's letter. He could have searched the bunkhouse, the office. He had 4 months. The possibility sat between them like something cold in the summer heat. We need to move, Nell said. We need to send word to the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver tonight before Creed can get there first. And we need to know what Creed's lawyer filed at the county office and exactly how the claim is worded. I can get the filing, Martha said. Both of them looked at her. The county recorder owes me a favor from 1871 that I've never called in. I'd say this is a reasonable time. She stood up. Give me until this evening. They gave her until this evening. They sat in Martha's back room and worked through what they knew and what they didn't know and what needed to happen in what order. And Nell wrote things down in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, and Caleb provided detail and questioned assumptions and twice changed his position when her reasoning was stronger than his, which she noted without comment. At one point, Martha came back in with coffee and looked at both of them and said to no one in particular, I've watched Caleb Rourke in this town for 12 years, and I've watched Nell Whitaker for 28, and I want both of you to understand that this. She gestured at the two of them, the coffee cups, the open notebook, the map corner. She could see, this is a considerably more interesting outcome than I expected from last night. Nell said, Martha. I'm just observing, Martha said and left. Caleb looked at his coffee cup. She does that, Nell said. I know, he said. She did it at my father's funeral. She looked at me and said, You're going to be all right, but not before you aren't. Was she right? He was quiet for a moment. She usually is. The filing from the county recorder arrived with Martha at 6 in the evening. She set it on the table without ceremony, and Nell picked it up and read it carefully twice with Caleb reading over her shoulder. She could feel his presence, the careful stillness of him, the way he breathed slowly when he was concentrating. The claim was detailed and professionally worded and bore the fingerprints of someone who had been planning it for a long time. It cited the absence of recorded survey documents. It cited the disrupted boundary markers. It cited the exploratory water use Creed's camp had established, which meant the diversion had been running longer than Caleb's writer had noticed, which meant it had been feeding the mining camp's use record for weeks. Nell set the paper down. He's built a case, she said. Brick by brick, Caleb agreed. While we were busy being enemies. He was quiet. That's what all of this was, she said. The vandalism, the missing stakes, the information about the flume damage, all of it was designed to keep us focused on each other. While we were fighting over the spring access, he was building a legal record on both sides of us. Caleb said very quietly, "Your father's proposal." She looked at him. "The marriage arrangement," he said. "Your father wrote to me because he saw the situation deteriorating and he was looking for a solution." But what if Creed also knew about the proposal? What if he knew that a unified Whitaker-Rourke claim would make his filing invalid? Nell went still. "The flume damage happened the same week my father wrote to you," she said. "Yes." "And the survey stakes went missing in the following 2 weeks." "Yes." "Howe was trying to prevent us from cooperating," she said. "The escalation wasn't random. He was escalating specifically because he found out there was a possibility we might work together." "Which means," Caleb said, "that we have already done the most dangerous thing we could possibly do to him." She looked at him. "We're sitting in the same room," he said, "on the same side of the problem." For a moment, the only sound was the summer evening working its way down toward dark and the distant settling of the building around them, and Martha moving in the front of the store. "Then we keep doing it," Nell said. She picked up her pen and opened the notebook. "Here's what happens next," she said. And Caleb leaned forward, and they built a plan together, and outside the valley went dark and dry and waiting, and neither of them thought about what they were building, or what it looked like from the outside, or what Martha Bell was thinking in the next room. They were too busy saving something that belonged to everyone. But late that night, riding back to Whitaker Crossing alone in the dark, because Caleb had insisted on at least seeing her to the valley floor before he turned back toward the mountain, Nell thought about what he had said on the ridge trail, about his brother, about the pass, about the decision he'd made that he couldn't unmake. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years building walls out of responsibility, and a woman who had spent years building walls out of independence, and how neither set of walls had actually kept anyone safe. She rode into her own yard, and put up her horse, and checked the south gate fitting out of habit. It was holding. She went inside and found her father awake at the kitchen table, the lamp lit, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. "Nell," he said. "Papa." She sat down across from him. "We know who Creed's man is. We know what was filed. And we think we know where the survey copy is." She paused. "We're going to fight this." Amos looked at her for a long time. "We," he said. She met his eyes. "Don't make it into something, Papa." "I'm not making it into anything." But the corner of his mouth moved. She told him what they'd found and what they were planning, and he listened the way he'd always listened, without interrupting, without inserting his own opinion until she'd finished, which was one of the better things about Amos Whitaker that she tried not to take for granted. When she finished, he said, "That's a good plan." "It's a beginning," she said. "It's a good beginning." He picked up his teacup and found it cold and set it back down. "What do you think of him?" She knew who he meant. "I think he's competent," she said. "Nell." "I think he's honest," she said. "Which is different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected a man who came to acquire something." She looked at the lamp flame. "He came to solve something. That's different." Amos said nothing. "Don't," she said. I didn't say anything. You were about to look satisfied. I'm just a sick old man trying to drink his cold tea, Amos said with the particular innocence he deployed when he was most guilty of something. Nell took his cup to the stove and reheated the water. Outside in the dry summer dark, the spring, that half the valley depended on, kept running steadily, indifferent to claims and counterclaims and all the human machinery of ownership. And at the north end of the valley in Creed's mining camp, Jonah Pike was delivering his report. And in the morning, everything was going to get considerably harder. The letter to Denver went out on the early rider the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Nell wrote it herself in the careful legal language she had taught herself from her grandfather's papers and the property law books she'd ordered from St. Louis 3 years ago when she first understood that managing a ranch meant understanding what could be taken from you and how. She cited the affidavit. She cited the grandfather's 1869 letter referencing the duplicate survey. She requested that the Territorial Commissioner's office confirm the existence of the document and place it under protective hold pending a county court proceeding. She sealed it, addressed it, and handed it to the writer with a second letter addressed to a lawyer in Colorado Springs, whose name Martha Bell had written on a scrap of paper the previous evening without being asked. "He's honest," Martha had said, which in a property lawyer is rarer than you'd think. Caleb arrived at Whitaker Crossing an hour after the writer left. He came alone without his foreman, which told Nell he had thought carefully about who he trusted this morning. He brought the accounting court had compiled overnight every assignment Jonah Pike had been given in 4 months at High Raven. Every area of the ranch he'd had access to every conversation anyone could remember. They spread it on the kitchen table beside Nell's notebook. It was worse than either of them had expected. Pike had been assigned to fence repair on the east boundary, the boundary closest to the missing survey stakes. He had worked 3 separate shifts on the upper water channel. He had twice been sent to the county seat on supply errands, which gave him access to the land office without anyone marking his presence as unusual. And in his second month at High Raven, he had spent a week repairing the tack room roof, which put him directly adjacent to the small office where Caleb kept the ranch's property records. Caleb looked at that entry for a long time without speaking. He had access to everything, Nell said. Yes. His voice was quiet and controlled in the way of a man who is managing something that would rather not be managed. Including this copy of my grandfather's letter. He looked at her. It was in your tin, in your cabinet, in your house. I know where it was, she said. I'm asking whether Pike could have known about it through your records, your boundary documentation, your grandfather's correspondence with mine. Caleb was still for a moment. Then he got up and went to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she gave him that. Some things needed a moment of space before they could be handled clearly. My father kept letters, he said, from the early ranchers in the valley, part history, part legal record. He believed in documentation the same way your grandfather did. He turned around. There are letters in that collection from Ezra Whitaker, your grandfather, about the spring. Did Pike have access to that collection? The tack room repair. The collection was stored in a trunk in the corner of the office. He stopped. He knew. He's known for months what we have and where we keep it. The implication of that was significant, and neither of them needed to say it plainly. If Creed had known about the Denver duplicate since spring, he'd had months to get ahead of it. Months to contact the Territorial Commissioner's office. Months to have a man in place. We need to know if the duplicate still exists before we build our entire case on it, Nell said. The lawyer in Colorado Springs can telegraph Denver directly, Caleb said. Faster than a writer. Martha already suggested that in her note. Nell closed the accounting report and looked at him. We also need to talk about the Parker family. The change in his expression was immediate and unguarded. The first fully unguarded thing she'd seen from him, and it told her something important. He hadn't forgotten the Parkers. He'd been thinking about them and hadn't said anything because he didn't know how to raise it without it looking like something it wasn't. Their well ran dry 4 days ago, she said. I've been carrying water to their stock every morning before you arrive. I didn't mention it because... She paused. Because you didn't want to ask me for anything, he said. She didn't deny it. High Raven can reduce its morning draw from the spring by 1/3, he said. Give the difference to the Parker allotment. That puts your cattle short. I'll move the south herd to the upper graze. There's still some water in the rock seep above the east pasture. It's a harder drive, but it's manageable for 2 weeks. That's significant labor. The Parkers have 3 children, he said, and a 4th coming before winter. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote it in her notebook. The adjusted water schedule, the high raven reduction, the Parker allotment. And she didn't say anything else about it because there wasn't anything else to say. It was the right thing, and he'd offered it without calculation, and she respected that more than she was going to tell him this morning. There's something else, Caleb said. She looked up. Last night before I rode back up, I stopped at the Valley Road junction. There were fresh tracks. 2 horses coming from the north, from the direction of the Meridian camp. He let that sit for a second. They turned onto the south trail, not toward town, toward Whitaker Crossing. The kitchen was very quiet. What time? She asked. Late, 2 hours after we parted. She thought about the path from the Valley Road junction to Whitaker Crossing. She thought about the south gate she'd checked before bed, the one she'd repaired in the dark 2 nights ago. I'll check the perimeter, she said, already standing. I already did, he said. I came early for that reason. She stopped. The south fence has a cut section, he said. 30 feet east of the gate, cut clean, not broken, and there are boot prints near your south water trough, same triangular heel mark. Jonah Pike had been on her property in the night. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and breathed that in. He didn't damage anything, Caleb said. Not that I could find, which means he came to look, to see what you have, what condition the spring outlet is in, whether you've reinforced the channel. He paused. Or to leave something. That was the part that made the cold move through her. Not the trespass. The possibility of something left behind. They went over the south property together, methodically, section by section. Caleb taking the fence line, and Nell taking the water infrastructure. She checked every fitting on the south channel, every valve, every junction point. She checked the spring outlet gate that she'd rebuilt 2 months ago. At the 3rd junction point on the east arm, she found it. It wasn't dramatic. It was a single pin removed from the pressure coupling and replaced with a slightly shorter version that would hold under normal flow, but would fail under peak summer pressure. The kind of modification that looked like original hardware if you weren't looking for it. The kind that would cause a catastrophic channel failure in 3 to 4 days when the afternoon heat pushed the flow to maximum. She held the false pin in her hand and stared at it. Caleb came around this corner of the channel bank and looked at what she was holding. His expression went very still. He's not working for Creed to gather information, Nell said. He's working to create the failures, the flume damage, the missing stakes, this. She held up the pin. Creed files a claim stating that neither ranch can adequately manage the water resource. Then he produces a record of repeated infrastructure failures on both properties. She looked at Caleb. He's building a negligence case alongside the ownership case. He wants to prove we can't manage the spring responsibly, so that the county has legal grounds to award management rights to a company with the resources to maintain it properly, Caleb said. Western Meridian Silver Company, Nell said, with professional engineers and a lawyer who knows how to write a court filing. They stood there in the summer heat with the false pin between them and the full architecture of what Creed had built slowly becoming visible in all its careful, patient ugliness. He's been at this for over a year, Caleb said. Probably longer, Nell said. Since before the drought. He needed the drought to make the spring valuable enough to be worth taking. Or he knew the drought was coming. Mining companies have geologists. They read land formations. He may have known the creek was going to drop before anyone else did. Caleb said something under his breath that she decided not to hear clearly. She replaced the false pin with a proper fitting from her toolbox and tightened it herself, and she did it with the precise, controlled movements of a woman who is very angry and is directing that anger into something useful. When she finished, she stood up and said, "We need to talk to every rancher in the valley, today." He looked at her. Creed's strategy works because we're isolated, she said. Whitaker Crossing and High Raven fighting each other while everyone else watches and worries. But if the valley ranchers understand what the spring claim actually means, Not just for us, but for every farm that depends on that water. Then Creed doesn't have two isolated enemies. He has an entire community. Some of them won't want to get involved, Caleb said. They're frightened of Creed's company money. Some of them won't, she agreed. But the Parkers will, and the Hendersons, and the Vega family, because Creed tried to buy their east parcel last autumn, and they know exactly what kind of offer that was. She tucked the false pin into her jacket pocket as evidence. We don't need everyone. We need enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll ride the North Valley. You take the South. Meet back here by late afternoon. He nodded and went to his horse. She called after him. Caleb? He turned. Be careful what you say about Jonah Pike when you talk to people. We don't have enough yet to make that accusation publicly without tipping Creed off. He looked at her steadily. I know how to be careful, Nell. She believed him. That was the thing, she was increasingly believing things about him that she hadn't expected to believe, and the speed at which it was happening made her cautious in a way that had nothing to do with Creed or water rights. She rode south. He rode north. The conversations she had that afternoon were some of the hardest of her life. Not because the ranchers were unkind, but because she could see the fear in every face she spoke to. The fear of a man with company money and lawyers, and the patience to wait out a drought. The fear of a water bill from someone who had no reason to charge a fair price. The fear that was the oldest fear in the valley, the fear that the land you'd broken your body on would be taken by someone who never touched it. She didn't promise them easy outcomes. She wasn't built for false promises. She told them the truth. The spring was designated common water under the 1861 survey. The claim Creed filed was built on manufactured evidence. There was a duplicate survey in Denver that could prove the designation. And if every rancher in the valley stood with documented water use records and community testimony, the county court could not grant a private company control of a publicly designated resource. The Henderson family signed on to the coalition before she finished talking. The Vega brothers said yes immediately, with a particular intensity that told her Creed's offer last autumn had been a great deal less than polite. The Parker family. Tom Parker, who was trying to keep his exhaustion from showing and managing it badly, and his wife Clara, who was not trying to hide anything at all, agreed with the kind of quiet determination of people who have nothing left to lose and have decided that means they have nothing left to fear. By late afternoon, Nell had 6 families committed. She rode back to Whitaker Crossing with the sun dropping behind the ridge, and her horse tired under her, and her mind running through the legal sequence she needed to build. When she pulled into the yard, Caleb was already there. He was sitting on the porch step talking to Amos, which was something she hadn't expected to see. And for a moment, she stayed on her horse and just looked at the two of them. Her father gesturing with one hand, the way he did when he was making a point, and Caleb leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and actually listening. She put up her horse and came to the porch. 5 families, Caleb said, looking up. North Valley. The McCready brothers, the Tunstals, the old Swede, up on the East Bench Larson. The Coopers on the flat, and a Homestead family named Bell that just came in from Kansas in the spring and already understands exactly what's happening to them. 6 on the south side, Nell said. 11 families total. 12, Amos said. Both of them looked at him. I sent word to the Johnsons on the Ridge Road this afternoon. Cord was kind enough to carry it for me. He looked at Caleb without apology. My legs don't work as well as they used to. My messenger service still does. Nell sat down on the porch beside her father. 12 families. 12 sets of water use records. 12 voices in a county courtroom. It wasn't certain. Nothing about this was certain. But it was the first moment since she'd unfolded that county notice in the early morning light that the picture had looked like something other than a wall. Martha telegraphed Colorado Springs, Amos said. The lawyer sent a wire to Denver. Both Nell and Caleb went still. And, Nell asked. Amos reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded paper. Not the kind of heavy paper official documents used. Telegraph paper. The thin kind with the words set in capital letters. He handed it to Nell. She unfolded it. She read it. Then she read it again. She handed it to Caleb without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened and then released which she was learning was the physical expression of a significant internal shift. The Territorial Commissioner's Office in Denver confirmed the existence of a duplicate water survey dated 1861, filed by the surveyor Elias Webb, under reference number 44-7, designating the mountain spring and its 50-foot access corridor as common water under the Homestead Act. The document was intact and on file, but the wire also confirmed that a representative of the Western Meridian Silver Company had contacted the Commissioner's office 6 weeks ago, requesting a review of the document's legal validity under current territorial law. 6 weeks ago. Before the county claim was filed. Before the survey stakes went missing. Before any of the escalation that had seemed from inside it like a sudden and overwhelming attack. Creed had been challenging the Denver document for 6 weeks while his man worked inside High Raven Ranch, and neither of them had known. "He almost buried it," Nell said. "Almost," Caleb said. "The commissioner's office didn't rule in his favor. The document stood. But he slowed it down. If he'd gotten a ruling in his favor before we filed the protective hold request." "We got there first," Caleb said. "By 2 days." 2 days. The margin of everything. Nell folded the telegraph paper carefully and put it in her jacket pocket next to the false pin. "We need that document transported from Denver to the county court before the hearing," she said. "Under armed escort if possible." "The Colorado Springs lawyer can arrange that," Caleb said. "That's standard procedure for critical evidence in property cases." "Then we need to tell him tonight." "I'll ride to town and wire him." "I'll come with you." He looked at her. Not with the particular look of a man who was about to suggest she didn't need to, which she appreciated. Just a look of acknowledgement. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. She went inside to check on Amos and found him already on his feet, moving toward his chair with the careful deliberateness he used when he was tired but wasn't going to admit it. "Papa," she said, "go to bed. I mean it." "I'm perfectly—" "You're tired and your color's wrong and I need you to be useful tomorrow, which means you need to rest tonight. Go to bed." He went. Not without a small expression of resentment that was purely ceremonial, because Amos Whitaker had always resented being sent to bed and always gone anyway when he was actually tired. She followed him to the back room, checked that he had water beside the bed and the window cracked for the night air, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her father, his gray hair against the pillow, his broad shoulders narrower than they'd been, his breathing even and slow. She loved him so ferociously in that moment that it felt like anger. She went back out. Caleb had his horse ready and was holding hers at the gate. She swung up without comment, and they rode toward town in the cooling evening air. It was halfway to town, on the long flat stretch of valley road, that it happened. They heard the hoofbeats a second before the rider emerged from the side trail, fast, urgent, the cadence of a horse pushed to its limit. The rider pulled up hard when he saw them. It was Cord. His hat was gone. There was dust on his face, and his eyes had the particular quality of a young man who has just seen something that reorganized his understanding of the situation. "Cord," Caleb said. "What happened?" "Pike came back," Cord said, breathing hard. "He came back to High Raven about an hour ago. Said he'd been in town on his own time. I didn't say anything, didn't let on we knew. I watched him." He stopped. "What did you see?" Nell asked. "He went to the office. He didn't take anything I was watching through the window. He left something." Cord reached into his vest and produced a folded paper. "I went in after he left and found it on the desk under the corner of the ledger. I don't know if it was meant to be found or left by accident." Caleb took the paper and unfolded it. Nell moved her horse close enough to read it with him. It was a document. Official-looking, formatted with the careful layout of a legal instrument. It bore a date from 3 months ago, and it bore at the bottom a signature, Caleb's signature. Nell looked at it without speaking. It was a water access agreement, apparently between High Raven Ranch and the Western Meridian Silver Company, granting the company permanent spring access rights in exchange for exclusive grazing privileges on company-owned land after Whitaker Crossing's water claim was resolved. After Whitaker Crossing's water claim was resolved, the implication was specific and deliberate. This document, if believed, said that Caleb Rourke had already agreed to let Creed take Whitaker Crossing's spring access in exchange for land that would benefit High Raven after Whitaker Crossing failed. Nell kept her eyes on the document. She heard Caleb's breathing change, not dramatically, but she was close enough now to read the small physical signals of a man she'd spent 3 days working alongside, and this was the change that meant something was being held down by force. "I signed a freight receipt in April," he said. His voice was very flat. "From the Meridian Company's supply wagon. They delivered fencing materials to the north boundary. I signed for the delivery. 1 page, 1 signature." He paused. "I did not sign a water agreement." She looked at the document, at the signature. It was his name in his handwriting, she was almost certain. But she had not seen enough of his handwriting to be fully certain, and that gap between almost and fully was exactly where Creed had made his investment. "He attached your freight signature to this document," she said. "Yes." "Can you prove the freight receipt was separate? If I kept my copy?" The pause was a fraction too long. "I may not have kept it. Routine delivery. I don't keep every receipt." She handed the document back to Cord. "Take this back," she said. "Put it exactly where you found it. Don't let Pike know you moved it." Cord looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. Cord turned his horse and rode back toward High Raven. Nell and Caleb sat on the valley road in the dimming light, and neither of them spoke for a moment. She was thinking. She was thinking hard and fast, and trying to think past the thing that was trying to pull her attention away from the logic. The thing that lived in the part of her that had been careful and guarded for very good reasons. The manufactured document was designed to be found. It was designed to destroy the fragile and functional thing she and Caleb had built over 3 days. It was designed to make her look at him and see what Creed needed her to see: a man who had been playing both sides, who had been useful and apparently honest right up until the moment the document surfaced. She knew all of that. She understood exactly what Creed had built and why. And still, the document existed. And she had not seen enough of Caleb's handwriting to be fully certain. And he had admitted he might not have the receipt. And she was a woman who had built her entire adult life on the principle that trust must be earned through evidence, not claimed through feeling. Caleb said very quietly, "You're deciding whether to believe me." She didn't deny it. "Yes." "And you can't decide." "I know what Creed is doing," she said. "I understand the document is manufactured. I believe it's manufactured." She stopped. "I also don't have proof that it is. And I've spent 28 years in this valley watching people trust the wrong men for the wrong reasons." "That's a fair position," he said. And he said it with such complete lack of defensiveness, no heat in it, no wounded pride. Just the plain, honest acknowledgement of a man who respected an honest accounting, that it made the decision harder, not easier, because it was exactly what she would have wanted him to say, and she couldn't tell whether that made it more true or less. "I'm not going to ask you to trust me," he said. "I'm going to ask you to tell me what evidence would change your position." She looked at him. "You think like a surveyor," he said. "You work from documented measurement. Tell me what measurement you need and I'll find it." She thought about it, genuinely thought about it the way she thought about water pressure and gradient and load capacity, not with feeling, but with the specific mechanics of what she needed to know. "The freight receipt," she said. "If it exists in any form, your foreman's copy, the delivery company's record, the Meridian Company's own ledger. Any record that shows that receipt existed as a standalone document. The Meridian Company won't give us their ledger. No, but their supply manager might have a different opinion about company loyalty if he understands he could be named as a party to a fraud proceeding." Caleb looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the close relative of one. "You want to find the supply manager before Creed does," he said. "The Meridian Company's supply operation runs out of the freight office in Colorado Springs. The lawyer there may be able to identify who manages their delivery ledgers." She met his eyes. "If the freight receipt exists in their records, it proves the signature was lifted from a standalone document. It doesn't just prove your innocence. It proves Creed fabricated a legal instrument, which is a criminal act. Which is a considerably more powerful position than a property dispute," Caleb said. "Yes." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as what I wish it were. She waited. I came to your father's house 3 nights ago because I was asked to consider a practical arrangement. I was told you ran the ranch. I wasn't told anything else. He paused. I've been working alongside you for 3 days, and I need you to know that nothing I've done in those 3 days, the water schedule, the Parker allotment, the plan, the ride up the mountain, none of it was done to earn your trust for the purpose your father had in mind. She was very still. I did those things because they were the right things to do, he said. And because you are the clearest thinker I have encountered in 12 years in this valley, and this situation required the clearest thinking available. He paused one more time. I want you to understand that, whatever you decide about the document. She held his gaze. I understand it, she said. She didn't say anything else. She was not ready to say anything else. But she filed it, all of it, the freight receipt, and the forged document, and those 4 plainly stated sentences on a darkening valley road, in the same careful mental ledger where she kept everything that mattered. Let's go send that wire, she said. They rode into town. The telegraph office was still open. Martha Bell was standing outside it, which was not a coincidence because Martha Bell was rarely anywhere by coincidence. She was holding another folded paper, and she looked at both of them with the expression of a woman who has 2 pieces of news and is deciding which one to give first. She gave the worse one first because that was Martha's way. Creed's lawyer filed a motion this afternoon, she said. He's asking the county judge to issue an emergency injunction freezing all water access from the spring until the ownership dispute is resolved. Nell went cold. An injunction would cut off every ranch in the valley. Parker family, Henderson family, Vega brothers, every farm that depended on the spring. If the judge grants it, Caleb said, every small farm in the valley loses their water within a week. And then Creed rides in with an offer, Nell said. Emergency water access, at his price, to families who have no choice. The hearing is set for 9 days from now, Martha said. 9 days. What's the second thing? Nell asked. Martha handed her the paper. Cord sent a boy with this 20 minutes ago. Nell read it. Then she said, Jonah Pike has left High Raven again. This time he took a pack horse. She handed the paper to Caleb. He read it. His face went to that still, careful place. Then he looked up. He's not going to the Meridian camp, Caleb said. A pack horse means he's carrying something. Or going somewhere he won't be coming back from, Nell said. Which means he's done what Creed needed him to do. The document was the last piece. The false pin in her pocket. The forged document on the desk at High Raven. The injunction motion filed that afternoon. The 9-day hearing. It was all moving now, all of it at once, with the velocity of something that had been held back for a long time and was no longer being held. We have 9 days, Nell said. She turned and went into the telegraph office. She had 3 wires to send. The Colorado Springs lawyer, the Denver commissioner's office, and one more to the federal marshal's office in Denver, because what she was looking at now was not merely a property dispute. It was fraud. It was evidence tampering. It was the deliberate sabotage of water infrastructure serving 12 farming families. It was the kind of thing that required someone with a badge and the authority to use it. She wrote the wires quickly and paid for them and came back out. Caleb was waiting. Federal Marshal, she said. I filed a report. He looked at her steadily. You think they'll move in 9 days? I think we have to give them the chance, she said. And I think if we build this case correctly, the forged document, the sabotage evidence, the supply ledger, the diversion pipe, 12 families' testimony, we give the marshal something he can actually work with. And if the judge grants the injunction before the marshal acts. She picked up her reins. Then we fight the injunction in court the same morning it's granted. Martha's lawyer friend has agreed to appear. She looked at Caleb across the space between their horses in the last of the evening light. We're not going to lose this, she said. She said it not as comfort, not as performance. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, directly, and because she meant it. Caleb looked back at her for a long moment. Then he said, No, we're not. They rode back toward the valley in the full dark, and somewhere above the ridge, The mountain spring kept running, and 9 days felt like both a very long time and no time at all. And Nell Whitaker did not let herself think about anything except the sequence of what had to happen next. Almost. She almost didn't think about anything else. 9 days. Nell had told herself 9 days was enough time. She had believed it when she said it standing in the dark outside the telegraph office with Caleb beside her, and the plan laid out clean and logical in her mind. She had believed it the way she believed in survey measurements and water gradients, because the math worked. By day 3, she understood that the math was only part of it. The injunction motion moved faster than anyone expected. Creed's lawyer filed a supplemental brief the morning after the original motion, citing 3 specific infrastructure failures on Whitaker Crossing and 2 on High Raven Ranch as evidence that neither property owner could responsibly manage the spring. He had dates. He had detailed descriptions. He had Nell realized with a cold and specific fury information that could only have come from someone who had been inside both operations. Jonah Pike had been thorough. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the supplemental brief spread in front of her when Caleb arrived on the 4th morning. He came in without knocking, which had become the unspoken arrangement somewhere between day 1 and day 4. And he read the brief over her shoulder without being invited, which she also didn't remark on. He documented the flume collapse, Caleb said, and the pressure-fitting failure on my east arm. Nell tapped the page. Which he caused. He's documenting his own sabotage as evidence of our negligence. That's... Caleb stopped. Sophisticated, she said. Yes. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The Colorado Springs lawyer. Has he reached the supply manager yet? He wired last night. The Meridian Company's freight ledger is kept by a man named George Aldred in their Colorado Springs office. Aldred has agreed to a meeting. She looked up. He's also agreed to bring the April delivery records. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not relief. It was too early for relief, but the particular quality of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing and just felt the first possibility that he might be able to set it down. When? He asked. The lawyer meets him this afternoon. If the delivery record shows the April freight receipt as a standalone document, he'll wire us tonight. And if Creed gets to Aldred first, then we find another way. She said it flatly because it was the only useful way to say it. But Martha thinks Creed doesn't know we're looking at the freight ledger. He built the forged document to look like a complete legal instrument. He may not have considered that we'd trace the original signature. He underestimated the level of documentation we'd pursue, Caleb said. He underestimated me, Nell said. He assumed I'd react emotionally to the forged document. That I'd confront you, you'd deny it, I'd doubt you, and we'd separate before we could build the coalition. She paused. He was close. Caleb looked at her. She met his eyes for a moment, and then looked back at the brief. But not close enough, she said. They worked through the morning. The coalition needed organizing 12 families with 12 different water use histories. 12 sets of records that needed to be collected, reviewed, and formatted into something a county judge could evaluate in a single hearing. Nell had designed the format. Caleb had assigned 2 of his most reliable writers to collect the records from the North Valley families, while Nell covered the South. At mid-morning, Clara Parker arrived at Whitaker Crossing. She came on foot, which meant the situation at the Parker homestead was worse than it had been 2 days ago. Clara was 26 years old and 8 months along, and had the look of a woman who had stopped sleeping properly sometime in the previous week, but she carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of someone who had decided that exhaustion was not relevant information. "Tom's cattle," she said from the doorway. She didn't come inside. She stood on the porch with her hands folded and her chin level. "The water Nell arranged isn't reaching the south pen. Something's blocked in the channel line." Nell was already getting up. Caleb was already getting his hat. They rode to the Parker homestead together, and Nell found the blockage in 20 minutes, a deliberate one, a bundle of brush packed into the channel junction with the particular careful compression that didn't happen by accident. She removed it with her bare hands and the channel ran clear. Tom Parker stood beside her while she worked and didn't say anything. He was 31 years old and looked 50, and he had the hands of a man who had worked every day of his adult life. and when the water ran clear into his south pen and his cattle moved toward it, he made a sound that he immediately controlled and turned into a cough and stared at the sky for a moment. Nell handed him the bundle of brush. "Keep this," she said. "It's evidence of deliberate interference with an active water allotment. We'll add it to the package for the court." He took it. He held it like it was something valuable. Caleb was standing a few feet away, and Nell saw him watching Tom Parker hold that bundle of brush, and she saw something cross his face. Not pity, nothing as dismissive as pity, but the real and grounded recognition of what was at stake in this fight for the families who had no legal resources and no high-ground property and no political connection, who had nothing except their work and their children and whatever water reached them from the mountain. They rode back to Whitaker Crossing in the afternoon heat. "That blockage wasn't Jonah Pike," Caleb said. "Pike left with his pack horse 4 days ago." "No," Nell agreed. "Creed has more than one person working in this valley." They both understood what that meant. They had assumed Pike was the sole operative. They had been wrong. "We've been focused on the legal case," Nell said. "Creed's been focused on the physical infrastructure. While we build the court package, he's still running the sabotage operation. Which means, even if we win the hearing, we come home to broken channels and blocked allotments. We need someone watching the water infrastructure around the clock." She thought quickly. "The coalition families, they're already organized. If each family takes a section of the channel line as their responsibility, they become the monitoring system," Caleb said. "And any interference they document becomes part of the community testimony. It also gives Creed's operative more targets to avoid. Harder to block a channel when 12 families are watching it." They organized it that afternoon. Caleb rode the north assignments, Nell rode the south. By evening, every section of the main channel and the spring outlet had a family assigned to check it twice daily and document anything unusual in a written log. It was the coalition becoming something more than a legal strategy. It was becoming a community in active coordination, which was the thing Creed's entire operation had been designed to prevent. Nell came home at dusk and found Amos sitting up at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that was actually hot for once, and the look on his face that meant he'd had a productive day, despite her best efforts to keep him resting. "The county judge denied the emergency injunction," he said. She stopped in the doorway. "Martha came by an hour ago with the word," Amos said. "The judge ruled that an injunction cutting off water to 12 farming families during a drought constituted undue hardship and required a full hearing before any restriction could be imposed. Creed's motion is denied pending the scheduled hearing in 5 days. 5 days instead of 9. The hearing had been moved up." "Why moved up?" she asked. "The federal marshal's office," Amos said. He was trying not to look too satisfied and failing. Apparently, a fraud and infrastructure tampering report filed by a certain valley rancher prompted the marshal to contact the county judge directly and request an expedited proceeding. The federal marshal had moved. Nell sat down. She sat down and looked at her hands on the table. The grease still in the creases from the channel work, the calluses from the fence, repair the old scar on her right palm from a wire stripping accident when she was 19, and she let herself feel the shift of it. The first real movement of the whole weight in a direction that wasn't further down. 5 days, she said. 5 days. Amos agreed. She looked at him. "How did you know about the marshal?" "I wrote to him myself," Amos said. 3 days ago, before you filed your report." He held up one hand before she could speak. "I know. I should have told you. But I was afraid you'd tell me not to, and I believed it was necessary, and I am still capable of making necessary decisions, even if my legs don't cooperate." She looked at her father for a long moment. "You wrote to the federal marshal," she said. "I may have also mentioned the forged document bearing Caleb Rourke's signature," Amos said carefully. "In my letter, which I wrote before you knew about the document." She stared at him. "How did you know about the document before I told you?" Amos set down his teacup with the expression of a man arranging a dignified retreat. "Cord is a very communicative young man when properly encouraged." "Papa, I'm a sick old man doing what he can with the resources available to him," Amos said. "Are you going to be angry at me, or are you going to use the 5 days?" she breathed out. Both, she said, starting with the 5 days. The wire from Colorado Springs came at 9 o'clock that evening. Martha brought it herself in person, which meant the news was significant enough to warrant a personal delivery. She sat down at the kitchen table without being asked and laid the telegraph paper in front of Nell. Caleb was still there. He'd been there through supper working through the legal package with Nell, and Amos had put food in front of him without ceremony, and he'd eaten it without making anything of the fact that he was eating in the Whitaker kitchen for the 4th consecutive evening. Nell read the wire. George Aldred, the Meridian Company's supply manager, had opened his freight ledger. The April delivery to High Raven Ranch was recorded. The freight receipt was documented as a single-page document covering fencing materials. The signature was recorded as received in full for the described goods, and nothing further. The document in the ledger bore a duplicate of the same signature one that matched exactly because it was a carbon impression taken from the original receipt at the time of delivery. The forged water agreement bore a signature lifted from a single-page freight receipt. The freight ledger proved it. Aldred was willing to testify, in writing under oath before a county court. Howe was also, according to the lawyer's note at the bottom of the wire, extremely interested in the fact that his company's delivery record had apparently been used to construct a fraudulent legal instrument, because George Aldred was the kind of supply manager who took the integrity of his paperwork personally, and the Western Meridian Silver Company was about to discover that company loyalty has a specific limit, and that limit is criminal fraud. Nell set the wire down. She looked at Caleb. He had been reading it over her shoulder again. She heard him breathe a slow, controlled exhale, the kind that carries something out of the body that has been lodged there for several days. "The forged document is provable," she said. "Yes," he said. "Creed filed a fraudulent instrument with the county court." "Yes." "That's not a property dispute anymore." "No," Caleb said. "It's not." Martha picked up the wire and read it herself, which she did with the focused attention of a woman who had been in on every stage of this and intended to remain so. Then she set it down and said, "The federal marshal arrives day after tomorrow. He wired the county sheriff this afternoon." Everyone at the table looked at her. "Martha," Nell said, "I may have been corresponding with the marshal's office independently," Martha said with complete serenity. "I've known Deputy Marshal Holt for 11 years. He's a thorough man. He asked me to keep him informed." Amos made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Caleb looked at Martha Bell with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he understood. "How long have you been corresponding with the marshal's office?" Nell asked. "Since Creed made his first offer to the Vega brothers last autumn," Martha said, "which I found suspicious for reasons I won't bore you with." She folded her hands on the table. "I am a storekeeper. People tell me things. I write them down. It seemed like information someone with a badge ought to have eventually." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Nell said, "Is there anything else you've been doing independently that I should know about?" Martha considered. "I've located Jonah Pike." The room shifted. "Where?" Caleb asked. "He's at a boarding house in Pueblo. He rode south, not to the Meridian camp. I believe he was planning to disappear once his work here was finished." Martha reached into her pocket and produced a folded paper that she handed to Caleb. "That's the address. The marshal's office can send someone, or the county sheriff can wire the Pueblo office." Caleb held the paper and looked at Martha Bell with an expression that had moved well past reassessment and into something closer to awe. "Martha," he said, "how—" "I have a cousin in Pueblo who notices things," Martha said simply. "The heel mark on the boot print. Nell described it to me, and I described it to my cousin in a letter I sent 6 days ago. My cousin is thorough." She picked up her cup. "Are we going to sit here being surprised, or are we going to use what we have?" They used what they had. The next 2 days were the most concentrated work of Nell's life. The legal package came together in her kitchen, piece by piece, each element slotting into the next, with the satisfaction of a survey calculation that resolves cleanly. The coalition families delivered their water use records. Aldred's written deposition arrived by express rider from Colorado Springs. The Territorial Commissioner's Office confirmed the protective hold on the Denver survey document, and arranged for a certified copy to be delivered to the county court by the morning of the hearing. The federal marshal arrived on schedule, spoke for 40 minutes with the county sheriff, and left for Pueblo with a warrant that bore Jonah Pike's name. Creed, to all appearances, did not know how much had shifted. He continued filing supplemental briefs through his lawyer. He held a meeting at the hotel in town with 3 Valley ranchers who were not part of the coalition, attempting to sign them onto agreements that Nell, who received a report from Martha within 4 hours of the meeting's conclusion, recognized immediately as the same framework as the forged Rourke document, slightly reworded. Howe was still building, still adding layers, still operating as though the foundation he'd constructed over 14 months was solid. On the evening before the hearing, Caleb came to Whitaker Crossing and sat on the porch with Nell while the last of the summer daylight went out of the sky. They had not talked about anything personal in 4 days. There had not been room for it. The situation had required everything both of them had every hour, and they had given it. And there was something in that shared expenditure that was its own kind of intimacy, even if neither of them named it. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. She waited. "When I rode home that first night," he said, "after your father's supper, after you threw my hat out the door." "I know what night that was," she said. "I found the flume damage," he said. "And I stood there in the dark looking at it, and I thought this valley is going to tear itself apart over water, and I'm going to end up in the middle of it, the same way I ended up in the middle of that pass 4 years ago. Making decisions with consequences I can't control." She was quiet. "I almost wrote to your father and told him the arrangement wasn't workable," Caleb said. "That I'd find another solution. Go to the county alone, fight Creed alone, whatever it took." "What stopped you?" He was quiet for a moment. "You did." She turned to look at him. "Not." He stopped and chose the next words carefully. "Not in the way your father intended. Not because of the arrangement. Because of the way you looked at me across that table after I said something careless about the spring. Like you were taking the full measure of me and hadn't decided yet what the measurement meant." He paused. "I don't think anyone had done that in a long time. Just looked at me without already knowing the answer." The evening air moved between them, warm and dry and smelling of late summer grass. "You were accurate," she said. "I hadn't decided. Have you?" She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she'd learned over the course of a week, not the surface of it, not the trail-weathered exterior that had been the first thing she registered, but the expressions underneath. The controlled anger that was actually grief. The restraint that was actually respect. The quietness that was not coldness, but something more like careful attention from a man who had learned that careless decisions cost more than he could afford to pay. "I've decided," she said, "that you're the most honest person I've dealt with in a professional capacity in 3 years." He heard what she left out. He heard it, and he didn't push at it, which was the right thing. "That'll do," he said. "For now," she agreed. They sat until the dark was full, and the ridge above them disappeared into the sky, and the spring somewhere above them kept running steady and indifferent, and very much still there. "Tomorrow," Nell said. "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed. The hearing was held outdoors, not by accident and not by ceremony. The courthouse had received word that every farming family in the valley intended to attend, and the courthouse could hold 30 people in reasonable comfort, and perhaps 50 in the particular discomfort that precedes a complaint to the county commissioner. So the county judge, a lean, unhurried man named Adler, who had been on the bench in this county for 9 years and had apparently been wired by the federal marshal's office the previous afternoon, set up in the open air of the courthouse yard with a table and a chair and the particular expression of a man who understands that the proceedings he is about to conduct are somewhat more significant than a routine property dispute. The valley had come. All 12 coalition families, their workers, their older children. The Vega brothers standing together with their arms crossed in the way of men who have been waiting for this moment for almost a year. Tom Parker in a clean shirt with Clara beside him, holding a sleeping infant that had arrived 6 days ago, 3 weeks early, and was doing fine. Martha Bell at the back in the particular position of a woman who expects to see everything and miss nothing, Silas Creed arrived with 2 lawyers and 3 company representatives in good suits, which was the visual statement of a man who believed that sufficient resources made the outcome irrelevant. He looked at the crowd, and then at the table where Nell and Caleb sat side by side, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite fear, but the cousin of it. Judge Adler called the proceeding to order. Nell presented the case herself. She had discussed it with the Colorado Springs lawyer who had offered to lead the presentation. She had declined. This was Whitaker land and Whitaker water and a Whitaker case, and she was going to stand in front of her community and make it herself. She laid it out in sequence without drama because the material didn't need drama. The 1861 survey and its common water designation. Her grandfather's 1869 letter confirming the Denver duplicate. The protective hold on the Denver copy. The certified copy itself, which the court courier had delivered that morning, and which Judge Adler examined with careful attention. Creed's lawyer objected twice. Both objections were overruled. She presented the diversion evidence, the false pin from her east arm channel, the canvas with the branding fluid stain, the boot print documentation. She presented George Aldred's deposition, the freight ledger entry, the carbon impression of the original signature, the proof that the water agreement bearing Caleb's name was constructed from a lifted signature. Creed's lawyer objected again louder. Judge Adler told him to sit down. She presented the coalition family's water use records, 12 properties. Decades of combined documented use consistent with the common water designation. Community testimony that no rancher had ever claimed exclusive spring ownership because the understanding in the valley had always been that the spring belonged to everyone. Then she called Tom Parker forward. Tom Parker stood up in his clean shirt with his hands at his sides and told the judge in the plain direct language of a man who does not waste words what it meant to have water deliberately blocked from his livestock, what it meant to watch cattle weaken in the summer heat, what it meant to be at the mercy of a company that had manufactured a legal claim to the one resource his family could not survive without. He was not dramatic. He was worse than dramatic. He was absolutely believable. When he sat back down, Clara Parker put her hand on his arm, and the sleeping infant did not wake, and the crowd in the courthouse yard was completely quiet. Creed's lawyer presented his case. It was professionally constructed and aggressively argued, and it collapsed in 3 specific places. The first was the Denver survey, which the common water designation made definitive. The second was Aldred's deposition, which destroyed the fraudulent agreement entirely. The third was a document Judge Adler produced himself a wire from the federal marshal's office, confirming that Jonah Pike had been taken into custody in Pueblo the previous evening, and had, in the particular way of men who understand that their employers' resources do not extend to protecting them from criminal prosecution, provided a detailed written account of his activities in the valley over the previous 4 months. Creed went very still when Judge Adler read that part aloud. Nell watched him from across the courthouse yard. He was a composed man. She would give him that. He sat in his good suit with his lawyers beside him, and he did not move or react in any way that the crowd could easily interpret. He simply became very, very still, the way a man becomes still when he is calculating what he has left and whether it's enough. It wasn't. Judge Adler ruled. The Western Meridian Silver Company's claim to the mountain spring was invalid. The 1861 Common Water designation was confirmed as legally binding under territorial law. All filings based on the forged water agreement were struck from the county record. The matter of the manufactured legal instrument and the infrastructure sabotage was referred to the federal marshal's jurisdiction for formal criminal proceedings. Creed was ordered to appear before the federal marshal's office within 48 hours. His 2 lawyers leaned in immediately, whispering. He listened. He nodded once, very controlled. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked across the yard at Nell. She held his gaze. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He picked up his hat from the table, said something brief to his lawyers, and walked out of the courthouse yard with the measured step of a man who has lost this particular fight and is already calculating the next one. Nell watched him go. Caleb beside her said quietly, "He'll try something else." "Probably," she said. "But not here. Not with 12 families and a federal warrant and a documented case." She watched Creed's back until he turned the corner. He needed us isolated and fighting each other. That's done now. The crowd around them was shifting, releasing the held breath of an hour-long proceeding. The Vega brothers were shaking hands. Martha Bell was writing something in the small notebook she carried everywhere. Tom Parker was talking to Judge Adler, saying something the judge listened to with full attention. Caleb said, "You were extraordinary." She turned and looked at him. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without decoration, as simple statement of fact. "You built that case in 5 days," he said, "with 12 families and 2 sets of ranch records and a forged document working against us. You stood up in front of this entire valley and took it apart piece by piece." He paused. "I want you to know I saw every part of it." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Amos appeared at her elbow. He had come to town in the wagon, which had required a negotiation. She'd decided not to fight, and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered his hand with hers, and the 3 of them stood there in the courthouse yard while the valley gathered around them. That afternoon, Nell proposed the water covenant to the assembled coalition families. She laid it out at the Parker kitchen table, which was the largest space available, and which Clara had set up with the particular determination of a woman who has been waiting to host something meaningful. 12 families in one room, summer heat pressing in from outside, the infant asleep in the corner without any consideration for historic moments. The spring remains common property. Every farm receives a survival allotment. Larger ranches contribute labor and maintenance. No company may purchase the spring. Records copied and stored in 3 separate locations. A community council for drought emergencies. She did not look at Caleb while she explained it. She felt him, though. The particular quality of his stillness from across the room. The same stillness she'd felt on the ridge trail when he'd told her about his brother. The stillness that wasn't absence, but was in fact the most concentrated form of his attention. She finished explaining. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Vega brothers looked at each other and nodded. Tom Parker said, "You have my signature." One by one. 12 families. Caleb signed last. He signed his name below hers on the covenant document, and she noticed, because she noticed everything, that he signed it without hesitation and without looking up at her, and the signature was clear and unambiguous, and nothing like the practiced carefulness of a man signing something he wasn't sure of. He was sure. That evening, walking out of the Parker house into the late summer air, Caleb fell into step beside her without discussion. They were almost to their horses when Amos called after them loudly enough to carry in the still air, "I'll find my own way home." Nell didn't turn around. She knew the expression on his face without seeing it. They walked to the fence where the horses were tied, and stood there in the cooling air, and neither of them spoke immediately. Then Caleb said, "He's going to look insufferably satisfied for the next 3 weeks. Minimum," she agreed. He turned and looked at her with the full specific attention she had come to recognize, and had stopped trying to be unmoved by. "The water covenant," he said. "It gives up High Raven's exclusive claim." "Yes. I signed it. I noticed." "I want you to understand," he said carefully, "that I signed it because it's right, not as a gesture, not because of any arrangement." "I know," she said. "Do you?" She looked at him. "Caleb, I've watched you give up water allotment for the Parkers' ride to town in the dark to protect a legal case you could have walked away from, and sign your name to a covenant that costs you something real." She paused. "I know." He was quiet. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small object that he held out to her. It was a key. Small iron, carefully made. Not decorative, functional, the kind machined for a specific lock. "I had a record chest made last week," he said, "while we were building the case, a fireproof one." He paused. "It holds the covenant, the survey copy, both ranches' property documents, the coalition records." He held the key steady in his outstretched hand. "It has 2 locks. I have 1 key." She looked at the key in his hand. She looked at him. She took it. She felt the weight of it small and real in her palm. "That chest doesn't open with 1 key," he said. "I understand what it means," she said. The evening settled around them warm and dry, and finally, for the first time in a week, something approaching still. "I'm not ready," she said, "to talk about what comes next. Not tonight." "I'm not asking tonight," he said. She closed her fingers around the key. "Go home, Caleb," she said quietly. Not unkindly. The way you say something to a person you expect to see again in the morning. He put on his hat and went to his horse and swung up. He looked back once, the way he had that first night from her porch. Then he rode, and Nell Whitaker stood in the cooling evening with an iron key in her closed hand and the mountain spring running somewhere above the ridge, steady and shared and still there, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had been saved. All of it. The key stayed in her jacket pocket for 3 weeks. She carried it every day, without thinking about it, the way you carry something that has found its place and stopped announcing itself. It was there when she rode the morning water check. It was there when she sat with the coalition families at the first community council meeting and helped them draft the emergency drought protocol. It was there when she stood in the county recorder's office and watched the clerk stamp the water covenant as official public record. 3 certified copies filed in 3 separate locations, exactly as she'd specified. It was there when she told her father she wasn't ready to discuss the matter, and Amos, who was many things but had never been a fool, said simply, "All right, Nell," and went back to his tea. The valley exhaled. Not all at once. Valleys don't work that way, and neither do people who've been holding their breath through 14 months of manufactured crisis. It came out slowly, in small visible releases. The Vega brothers repaired the east fence line that had been in dispute since the previous autumn without being asked and without making any announcement about it. Clara Parker named the new baby Margaret Nell, which Nell heard about from Martha and had feelings about that she kept entirely to herself. Tom Parker put up a new gatepost at the entrance to his property and carved his family name into it, which was the act of a man who has stopped wondering whether he'll still be there next year. High Raven and Whitaker Crossing settled into the water covenant schedule with the practical efficiency of 2 operations that had been running parallel problems for years and had finally been given the correct tools. Caleb's crews worked the upper channel maintenance. Nell's crews managed the outlet infrastructure. They communicated through a shared log that lived in a wooden box at the junction point between the 2 properties' entries, written in both their hands, practical and specific about water pressure and valve timing, and the minor repairs that kept a mountain spring running through a dry summer. She read his entries every morning. She told herself it was professional necessity. Caleb came to Whitaker Crossing twice a week for the first 2 weeks. Business purposes. The water schedule, the covenant records, the federal case against Jonah Pike, that both ranches were providing documentation for. He sat at the kitchen table. He ate whatever Amos put in front of him. He and Nell worked through whatever needed working through, and then he left, and neither of them made anything of the fact that he always seemed to find one more thing to discuss before he went to his horse. On the 3rd week, he came 3 times. On a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, he arrived at Whitaker Crossing and found Nell on the south fence doing repair work that did not require 2 people. He tied his horse and came over and held the wire taut without being asked, and they worked the fence for 2 hours without discussing anything except the wire tension and the corner post that needed resetting. When they were finished, she said, "Stay for supper." He stayed. Amos produced a meal that was considerably more elaborate than usual, which Nell decided not to comment on. After supper, Amos went to bed earlier than was necessary. Nell and Caleb sat on the porch. "The federal case is moving," he said. "Marshal Holt wired yesterday," she said. "Pike is cooperating. He's named Creed as the architect of the whole operation. Creed's lawyers are trying to limit the exposure, but the freight ledger and the documented sabotage make that difficult. Creed's company is pulling out of the valley." Martha said the same thing this morning. Nell looked at the dark shape of the ridge against the evening sky. "He'll find another valley, another drought, another pair of families fighting over something he can use." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but not this one." "Not this one," she agreed. The quiet settled between them. The particular quality of quiet she'd come to recognize as specific to him. Not absence but presence. The kind of silence that comes from a man who is thinking something he hasn't decided how to say. "I sent the chest to the county recorder's office today," he said. She turned and looked at him. "The record chest," he said. "The fireproof one. I had it installed in the county vault with the covenant documents inside. The court can access it in any legal proceeding." He paused. "Both keys are required to open it. The county recorder has my key on file. You have yours." She reached into her jacket pocket. The key was there. She'd known it was there. She wrapped her fingers around it and held it. "Why the county vault?" she asked. "Because those documents belong to the valley," he said. "Not to either ranch, not to either of us." He looked at her steadily. "They should be somewhere that keeps them safe, regardless of what happens to Whitaker Crossing or High Raven, or—" He stopped. "Regardless of anything." She understood what the stop meant. What he'd been about to say, and had chosen not to, because he'd said he wasn't going to ask, and he was keeping that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come back Saturday." He looked at her. "For supper," she said. "Come back Saturday for supper. And don't," she chose the words carefully, "don't come with any particular expectation. Just come." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening dark. "All right," he said. He put on his hat and went to his horse, and she watched him ride out the gate and didn't look away until she couldn't see him anymore, which was longer than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. Saturday came. She set the table with her mother's white dishes, which she had not used since the night of the first supper, the night that felt in retrospect like something that had happened to a different version of herself who had not yet understood what the next 10 days would require of her. She lit the lamp. She cooked a real meal, the kind that took time and intention, and she did it without resentment and without performance, just the plain satisfaction of doing something well. Amos came into the kitchen while she was working and stood in the doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. "Don't," she said without turning around. "I was just going to ask if you needed help with anything," he said innocently. "You were going to say something that would make me tell you to go sit down." "Those are not mutually exclusive," Amos said, and went and sat down. Caleb arrived exactly when he'd said he would, which she had expected. She had learned that about him. He arrived when he said he would, and left when he said he would, and did what he said he was going to do. And this consistency, which seemed small and unremarkable, was in her experience neither small nor particularly common. He knocked. She opened the door. He had his hat in his hand already. He had taken it off before he knocked, which he'd been doing since the second visit, and she'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing things that have become the natural order. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the table with her mother's white dishes, and the lamp burning, and the meal she'd made, and he looked at her, and he said very quietly, "Nell." Just her name. The way you say a name when you've been thinking it for a long time. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's ready." They sat. Amos said a brief grace that was somewhat longer than usual, and contained what Nell interpreted as editorial content, and then they ate. The conversation was easy, in a way that surprised her, not because she hadn't expected it to be, but because ease of that particular quality, the kind that doesn't require any construction or maintenance, was rarer than she'd let herself remember. Caleb talked about the upper channel repair. She talked about the first coalition council meeting, which had been productive and only mildly chaotic, and how Tom Parker had turned out to be a capable moderator once someone gave him the floor. Amos talked about the letter he'd received from the territorial commissioner, acknowledging the water covenant as a model for common resource management, which he read aloud with the particular satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been vindicated. After supper, Amos announced that he was tired, which he was not, and went to bed, which was where he'd been planning to go since approximately Monday. Nell and Caleb took the lamp to the porch. The summer was ending. She could feel it in the air, the particular way the heat began pulling back from its full intensity, not gone, but retreating, the first suggestion of the autumn that would come in 6 weeks and change everything again, the way seasons do. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I need to say it before I think about it too much, because I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and thinking is not improving my relationship with it." He waited. He was good at waiting. My mother was the most capable person I've ever known, she said. She understood land and animals and medicine and weather and people. She was extraordinary. She paused. She married my father at 22 and spent 30 years doing everything she was capable of in the service of this ranch and this family, and she was happy. I believe she was genuinely happy, but... She stopped. But, Caleb said. But she never became what she could have become. She never had the room. Nell looked at the dark ridge. I watched that, and I decided at a very young age that I would not put myself in a position where someone else's life consumed mine. Not because I don't want partnership, because I want it to mean something real. Not possession, Caleb said. Not possession, she agreed. Not administration. Not one person's ambitions housed inside another person's name. He was quiet for a moment. My brother was 26 when he died, he said. He was going to marry a woman from the South Valley. He'd been planning it for a year. They'd decided she would keep her family's homestead, and he would keep his place at High Raven, and they would ride between them, which was unconventional, and I didn't fully understand it at the time. He paused. I understand it now. He knew something I didn't know yet. Nell turned and looked at him. A marriage should make both people more themselves, he said. Not less. He held her gaze. I understand what you're telling me. I am not asking you to become smaller. I know, she said. That's the problem. He blinked. That's the problem. It's considerably easier, she said with the dry precision she used when something was both true and inconvenient, to maintain a position when the other side is giving you reasons to hold it. You keep removing my reasons. Something crossed his face. That was the full version of the almost smile she'd been watching develop for a month. That was not a strategy, he said. I know that too, she said. That's also the problem. He set down his coffee cup. He turned toward her on the porch step. Not crowding her, not closing the distance without permission, just turning so that when she looked at him, she saw his full attention clear and direct, and without any of the careful management she'd watched him apply to everything else. Nell Whitaker, he said. I came to your father's house 5 weeks ago because a practical man asked me to consider a practical arrangement. I sat at your table and said something careless, and you threw my hat into the yard, and I went home and found my flume damaged and thought this valley is going to break before winter. She listened. I have spent 5 weeks watching you, he said. Not the way your father hoped I would watch you, not for the purpose he had in mind. I watched you build a legal case in 5 days. I watched you carry water to the Parkers before sunrise every morning without telling anyone. I watched you stand in front of 12 families and take apart a 14-month conspiracy piece by piece, and then propose a solution that gave something back to every person in that yard instead of just winning. She held herself still. I watched you, he said, and I stopped thinking about practical arrangements. I started thinking about the fact that I have been running a mountain ranch alone for 4 years, because I believed I was not the kind of man who had any business asking a woman to share that life. He paused. And then I met a woman who would not have accepted that framing for a moment. The evening air moved between them. I am not asking you to come to High Raven, he said. I am not asking you to put your name inside mine, or your ranch inside my property line, or your life inside my plans. He looked at her directly, with the full, clear, gray-eyed attention that she had learned was the most honest thing about him. I am asking whether you are willing to build something that belongs to both of us, on terms we make together, starting from equal ground. The lamp burned between them. She thought about the key in her pocket, the chest in the county vault. 2 locks, 2 keys, 1 opening. She thought about 5 weeks of watching a man be exactly who he appeared to be, and how rare that was, and how she'd spent years maintaining the appropriate skepticism about it, and how the skepticism had done its job, and the evidence had come in on the other side anyway. She thought about her mother, who had given everything and been happy, and about the different kind of happiness that might be possible for a woman who didn't have to give everything, who could give something real and keep something real and call it a marriage that actually fit her. I have conditions, she said. He said immediately, tell me. Whitaker Crossing stays in my name. Whatever we build together, this ranch is mine, not ours, mine. Agreed. High Raven stays in yours. That was already my position. The Water Covenant management stays under my oversight. I am the Valley's water steward. That doesn't transfer to a joint title or a committee. Agreed. You built it. You run it. Any decision that affects both properties requires both of us. In writing. No unilateral. Nell. His voice was quiet, and the almost smile had become real. Yes. She stopped. Yes to all of it, he said. Yes to everything you're going to say before you say it, because none of it is unreasonable, and all of it is you, and that's the part I'm agreeing to. She looked at him for a long moment. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the key. She held it in her palm between them. I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, she said. He looked at the key and then at her. I know, he said. I knew you still had it. How? Because if you'd decided no, you would have given it back. You don't keep things that have stopped being useful. She looked at him. That's a very accurate observation. I've been paying attention, he said. She closed her fingers around the key, and then, with the deliberate precision she brought to everything that mattered, she opened her hand again and set it on the porch step between them. I'm not ready to make promises tonight, she said. I'm ready to say that I want to. He looked at the key on the step. He picked it up and placed it back in her open palm and closed her fingers around it. Then keep it, he said, until you're ready. She kept it. 3 weeks later, on the last warm evening of summer, they married beside the mountain spring. The ceremony was simple because neither of them was built for ceremony, and because the valley had already given everything it had to, the more important fight, and didn't need to perform anything more. Judge Adler said the words. Both of them said yes without hesitation. Amos cried, which he would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Martha Bell did not cry, but she did take notes, which was her equivalent. The Parkers came. Young Margaret Nell was 4 weeks old and slept through the entire proceeding with an indifference to historic moments that Nell found entirely appropriate. The Vega brothers came. The Henderson family. Tom Parker in his clean shirt. Again shook Caleb's hand for a long time and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear, and Caleb listened and nodded. Cord from High Raven came, and the two families' ranch hands ate together at one long table and found that they already knew each other well enough from 5 weeks of shared channel work that the conversation was easy. Martha stood up at the end of the meal and said without preamble, I want everyone in this valley to understand that I have been watching these two people for 5 weeks, and I want to go on record as saying that the fact that they managed to get here without either of them saying a sensible word before approximately last Thursday is a testament to the particular stubbornness of intelligent people. Caleb said, Martha. I'm just observing, Martha said and sat down. Amos, who had been waiting for his moment, leaned over to Nell and said quietly, I want you to know that I am aware that my judgment was unsound in the method and sound in the substance, and I would appreciate it if you remembered mainly the second part. Nell put her hand over his on the table. I know, Papa. He covered her hand with both of his. In the years that followed, the mountain spring ran steadily through droughts and wet seasons, and all the ordinary emergencies of valley life. The Water Covenant held. The coalition became the model. Amos's letter from the territorial commissioner had suggested it might. 3 other Colorado valleys sent representatives to study how it worked, and Nell explained it to them the same way she'd explained everything in her life, plainly and precisely, and without any more ceremony than the situation required. High Raven and Whitaker Crossing ran as separate operations and cooperated as neighboring ones, which was exactly what they'd agreed and exactly what worked. Caleb rode between them. Nell rode between them. They argued twice a year about water schedule priorities and resolved it in writing as agreed. They agreed on everything else considerably more easily, which surprised neither of them. Amos lived to see his granddaughter take her first steps on Whitaker ground, which was what he'd been holding on for, though he would not have said it in those words. He died in his chair by the kitchen window on an April morning with the spring light coming in, and Nell sat beside him until the light changed, and then she got up and went out to check the south channel, because he would have wanted her to, and the fitting was holding fine. The summer school. Nell started met on Wednesday afternoons in the Parker barn, which was large enough and whose owner was enthusiastic and whose wife turned out to be an excellent teacher of reading. Ranch daughters came. Some sons came too, because Clara Parker had opinions about who deserved to understand property law. Nell taught the water and land sections herself. Martha Bell taught the business section with a directness that the children found alarming and educational in equal measure. Caleb trained his younger riders differently from how he'd been trained. He told them plainly that the measure of a man running cattle in the mountains was not how fast he made decisions, but how accurately, and that accuracy required listening to people who knew things you didn't know, and that pride was the most expensive thing you could carry at altitude. Some of them understood him. Some of them needed another year. He was patient with all of them because he had learned patience late and knew the value of it. One autumn afternoon, when the first cold was coming down from the ridge and the valley was settling into its pre-winter quiet, Caleb found Nell at the spring outlet gate checking the coalition's water log before the seasonal maintenance meeting. He came and stood beside her and read the log with her the way he'd been reading things beside her for years. She closed the log and looked at the water moving into the valley channel. "My niece asked me yesterday," she said, "why the record chest requires 2 keys. What did you tell her?" Nell was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandfather's affidavit and the carbon impression in a supply ledger and an iron key in her jacket pocket, and a man who had sat at her table uninvited and said 4 words. "I agreed to consider it," that had turned out to be the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She thought about her mother, about the teacher her mother had wanted to become, about the kind of love that makes room and the kind that fills it up. "I told her," Nell said, "that anything powerful enough to keep people alive should never belong to only one hand." Caleb was quiet beside her. The water ran. "Was that the right answer?" he asked. She looked at him. At the face she knew now the way she knew the water gradient and the south channel pressure and the corner post on the east fence. Not as something she had learned, but as something that had become part of how she understood the world. "It was the true answer," she said, "which is the best kind." He looked at her for a moment with the full, clear attention he'd never stopped giving her, and that she'd never entirely gotten used to, because some things shouldn't become ordinary. Then he reached over and took the water log from her hand and tucked it under his arm. "Come on," he said. "Council meeting starts in an hour." She fell into step beside him. Not behind, not ahead. Beside. The valley that had almost been taken from them opened out on every side, 12 families worth of fences and fields and cattle and children and stubborn, persistent human effort. And the spring ran down through it, the way it had always run, indifferent to ownership and grateful to none of them, simply doing what water does when it is allowed to. Finding its way. Sharing itself equally. Reaching everyone it could. The valley was not saved because 2 people married. It was saved because 2 proud people learned in the hard, specific way that real learning happens through evidence and error, and the willingness to revise that love was not ownership, and peace was not surrender, and survival became possible only when the people who had the most were willing to hold it in both hands and open their fingers. And what remained when the summer was done, and the crisis was past, and the legal documents were filed, and the water was running where it needed to run, was something simpler and more durable than any of it. 2 people, 1 valley. And the understanding that some things to be kept must